Since we seem to have already established a jocose mood, and inasmuch as for the last several meetings I seem to have presented data that got wearisomely complex, then why not we just continue the silliness, and I will only touch on matters completely impertinent and irrelevant. As a matter of fact, one could be, I mentioned this term once or twice over the last few weeks, but we might as well go ahead if we're going to just sort of kill the evening, and I can wrap it all up right quickly. And that was the matter of contrasts. The great matter of counterpoint, distinction, divergence, dissimilitude, juxtaposition, complement, contrariety, or the one I like, simply contrast. It is impossible to smell one smell. It would be impossible to touch one touch. Ordinary consciousness could not exist were it not for contrast. You could look at contrast as being synonymous to sensual consciousness, that is, ordinary city consciousness. Were it not for contrast, there would be no consciousness. And it's not really funny, although I intended it to be, to say that you can't smell one smell. If you do not have two samples of anything, you cannot be conscious of one. If all you ever had in your life was one smell, you had one odor, do you hear me, you would have no sense of smell. You wouldn't know whether you were smelling anything or not. If you were wired up either to only smell one smell or there was only one smell available, and you reached the age of majority and you walked out of the garden and there it was, you smelled the one smell, you would have smelled nothing. No, you couldn't discuss smelling. Nobody could ask you whether you'd ever smelled anything. If they tried to describe it, you'd say no. You have to have two samples to be conscious of one. And in a humorous way, I suggest to you that that's true with all the senses. In even a more humorous way, I suggest to you that that's true with thinking. That you could not have one thought. A matter of contrast, you could look at it also, to wrap it up, since it has, as I said, no pertinence, and it obviously has no relationship to anything else at all. You look upon the matter of contrast as though there were two pools of contrast. And what could we call them? We could call them different ends of the visible spectrum. We could call them red and blue. We could call them black and white, true and false. But black and white, people use that as two extremes. And so that you would have to have these two pools. Oh, I know. Since it's not related, I guess it's safe to say it. We could just say, beyond all that, you could say that the pools would also include, or we could call them, C and D. Now, for contrast, you would have to have, as I was trying to point out to you, without any debate and no theory and not being cute words, you have got to have at least two samples or you got no contrast. You cannot smell one smell. So, the bare minimum for contrast would be what? Two pools. Two areas, two sources to draw on contrast, except for this, now that I think about it. You'd really have to have a third one. Because if you only had the two, then, may I say immediately, if not sooner, you would have run through all the combinations. Am I right? Here's your two combinations. That's it. They would have spent themselves. You would have had that one immediate contrast like Blam or Bluey or whatever they say nowadays in the cartoons. That would have been it, and it would have spin itself. So now that I think of it, I would suggest to you that there has to be at least a third pool. So we could call that, to go along with the alphabetical running, that you would have to have a pool that would furnish a continuing supply of fresh contrast. Sounds all right thus far to me. I could also point out to you that the five senses themselves are not constructed to abide boredom. They are not molecularly structured to be inactive. And, of course, a splendid, if not a sterling, definition of boredom is inactivity. The senses are not constructed to tolerate, to operate on the basis of inaction. Thus, from one silly viewpoint, I could say that out of desperation, they invented daydreaming, imagination, memory. I'm talking about out of silly desperation. An insufficient lack of activity would spell the demise of the senses. It would be not what some of you imagine. It would be, in truth, terminal ennui. It would be the death of the senses. Continuing with the frivolities and the one-liners, could you see that we could, or I could, since I'm playing the Henny part, even if I'm no longer a young man, that we could say that part of the fuel to keep the senses active is contrast. Contrast. You can call it all kinds of things if we had time. I don't have time for you to call them all those things. But they would all fit neatly under the heading of, what did I say? Contrast. Contrast. There is an old sayings. In fact, I believe there are more than one, but one old saying comes to mind. Of individuals, institutions, making a comment that translates into this, that we must help man, in some particular instance usually, we must help man, or we must save man from himself. Since I like a funny meditation moment as much as anybody, everyone take a second and fumigate on that one. Or if you're ahead of me, refumigate on that one. So we must save man from himself. Now, in what way is this absolutely unrelated to the matter of conquest? In what way is this absolutely unrelated to the matter of contrast then? What if there's a certain kind of inner need in man for conquest beyond drawings of Pugel's, me speaking about keeping the senses active? How about these ideas like a contrast between what seems to be a feeling of I and me, what seems to be a feeling of a conscious me and an unconscious me, a good me and a bad me, a me that might be worthy of some attention, and then a me that should be ignored if not stoned. Does that fit into the definition of, I know it's not conquest, of, what was it? Contrast. Is there any way that would fit in? I know I'm stretching for humor. If I'd known we were going to take this approach tonight, I would have certainly written up some better jokes. But is there any way that that could be in a kind of humorous way connected to the matter of contrast, not on your life? There's no way, I see no connection whatsoever. We absolutely could not say that the need for contrast is necessary for man so that he can individually be aware of himself as a self-conscious being in the midst of life's otherwise dull, flat, colorless, non-contrasting creatures and parasites. There is no way that man's ability, man's need to even, be filled with contrast. There's no way that that would distinguish him from anybody else, anything else. Now that I brought it up and think about it, I guess that's just clear as it can be. So we definitely could say that that has no relationship to man's so-called self-consciousness, or awareness of himself. That his need, or if you want to call it his ability, to contrast, to be able to sample at least two things, and then apparently be aware of one of them from the two samples, such as I, out of an equation of, how does that go? I plus not I, me and you. That kind of contrast I don't see could have any relationships whatsoever to the operations known as human consciousness. None. Now, of course, that's what makes it so funny. But, as long as we're being funny, let me ask a real funny one. What if all conflict, inner, outer, mundane, metaphysical, what if, get ready for a real gut buster. I can hardly contain myself just thinking what I'm about to say. What if all human conflict is nothing more than life's simple need for contrast? I'm talking about routine, everyday, ho-hum need for contrast. And such being the, I told you, just lay on the floor. It's, what if that were the basis for each, I said each, yes, and I meant it, and I said every, or I'm about to, each and every form of human conflict, division, divergence, juxtaposition, and all the others. And especially dissimilitude, which has more syllables than any other synonym I know for contrast. I do not know how in the world I think of such ridiculous things. Now that I started, how about consider a few more things? What if we're speaking about contrast and truth, that we're correctly meaning contrast when we talk about such things as fads, fast food contrast? How about fashion? Friends and enemies. National boundaries, political parties, different religions, different races, new scientific facts, new social facts. All arguments, all agreements. And how about in the arts? Not just what an ordinary person might immediately think about shifting artistic taste. How about the arts themselves? The arts themselves are nothing but contrast, because I must ask you, how can you have music with one note? Got to have at least two. If you only heard one note, no one in the world would know what music was. You got to have at least two samples. How could you have a painting if you had one color? How could you have a painting if you could only draw either a horizontal line, a vertical line, or a diagonal line on paper? You would have to have contrast if there was any validity to this. How about, let's attempt a data tangent and go off even into a more ridiculous area. How about the areas that would seem to be a little more individual and personal? I don't guess after I start to say the ones I was thinking of, I'll have to point out the seriousness also of these matters. What if the reality was the need for contrast, that this was the reality behind such verbal and apparently emotional shadows known as bad habits / good intentions? The desire to change and reform / and the inability to do so. Falling in love / falling in hate. What if all of the important matters, all the important conflicts, all the important questions in human life were, quote, meaningless as perceived? Not theoretically, not in a binary sense that they can be explained away or argued that, wait a minute, you worry about whether you're doing good, and it's ridiculous. You're in the wrong religion to start with, so you couldn't do good if you tried. That sort of thing. Now, I mean meaningless as perceived. Meaningless. That what human consciousness is talking about is so imperfect, is so lacking, that it's not, how do you exaggerate on the term, it's not even close? Well, the exaggeration is to be able to talk to people who have an awareness of the situation as soon as I approach it, so that you don't have to be so mundane and routine as to even say it's not even close, because that brought it too close. To even concede verbally that there is some grounds for even making a comparison. I'm on a roll now. I told you it'd get funny. I knew I would find my humor operations and get them turned on. What if that were true? What if it was all simply the need? Now, when I say need now, the funny part that I'm inferring is I'm not talking about some accidental something. I'm not talking about that this is just some way that I could stretch words around, since I am trying to be funny tonight. Star Search is having their auditions here in town. Is why I was. But what if it was an absolute need? What if, as somebody has inferred and hinted before, I think, in this room, that there's a whole nother flow of, what do they call it, kid? Reality kind of stuff going on, and it's not what it seems to be out here. But what it seems to be and what everybody calls it is not incorrect. We're not right and them wrong. I always say that to give you people a way out. It's not mistaken perception. It's the majority of life's body operating on less than available information. And I say that on the basis that there's some available that other people don't have. I happen to know that for a what? Fact. I happen to know that what? Unknowingly. So what if it were true? Worse than that, what if it were correct? That all of this as long as I've gone this far, I mean all of this was simply the absolute need for contrast, or else you as a human being, I'm trying to grant all of you that, you would not be fully a human being. You would not be what everyone else in the city calls just walking around conscious. That you've got more or less all five senses operating to a minimal degree to keep you alive. And you seem to have this some kind of analyzing function up here about the senses operating to some degree. That is, you pass for being a conscious person. Now, what if the manifestations, what if the questions, what if the problems, what if the ills, what if the imagined difficulties of all people, individually and as a race, were nothing more? I know you begin to kill humor when you repeat yourself, but that's so good. I just can't resist. It was nothing more than the absolute need for contrast, and that was it. I guess you can hear it, the kid's laughing so hard he's about to hurt himself. Somebody give him a glass of water. Don't choke. Jesus. Ponder the potential humor in that if all of the serious questions, and I'm not treating those lightly because you've got to have a kind of, at least apparent built-in pathos to have the right, to make things funny you need, what do you call it, the right contrast, contract. Anyway, for things to be funny. So I'm not making light, but the serious questions like, what's going to happen between the struggle between good and evil? How did it come about? Who's going to win? And why? What if it's meaningless? Not in a religious sense, not in a moral sense. I'm talking about in a goddamn sense. That you have got to have contrast for life to stay alive, for humans to be conscious, and it does not make a good goddamn what the contrast is. I told you it was funny. It's good and evil, sweet and sour, up and down, right and left, men and women, black and white, hawks and doves, Republicans, Democrats, left and right, thin and fat, tall and short, fair and dark, Jesus, north and south, east and west. That none of it is any more than the absolute, basic, everyday, run-of-the-mill need in life for contrast. Which I attempted to start out this humor with a certain bit of, believe it or not, logic when I pointed out to you that you could not be conscious without at least two samples, which makes a contrast. You could not smell. You would have no sense of smell. It's a moot question. You wouldn't know whether you did or not if there was only one smell. So you got to have at least two. There'd be no touch. If you touched one thing, that was all you could touch. You could never have the sense of touch. Or we're back to the absolutely 4D moot situation that you wouldn't know whether you did or not. You couldn't talk about it. You would not be conscious of it. If you only tasted one taste, you got no sense of taste. You got to have two, at least two. Then you can say I got a sense of taste. There's that one, and then the second one. I tasted one time, and then a little bit later time, a second later time, an hour later, I tasted another one. I know what taste is. And then you can say, one of them tastes good, one tastes bad. One tastes left, one tastes right. One tastes like a Democrat, one tastes like a Republican. But you would have to have at least two. You would have to have two to be conscious. The funny part is, I don't want to get serious by any means in the midst of this, but the real funny part, that is, peculiar part is, that that's a fact. But you just can't get away from that, as funny as it is. You could not have one thought. If you only had one thought, you could not discuss thinking. You would not know whether you could think. You would not actually be thinking. You could have one thought, I don't care what it was, but you would have to have a second one at some other time. And then you go, ah, but you've got to have two samples to be conscious of one. To be conscious even of one. Don't forget. We're not talking about anything theoretical. To be conscious of just one, even one, you got to have two samples. You got two samples, they got to contrast. Do I have to point out the obvious? When I say you got to have two smells, they got to be two different smells. Did I leave that out? Do I have to come around to everyone's table and serve your oatmeal and your gruel? We could say, all right, we got two smells. You had one. And you would say, well, I don't know what you mean. You say, all right, just trust me. You say, all right, now wait a minute, and you wait a little while, and you say, all right, do it again. And they go, it was the same smell. They say, well, there would have to be a what? A contrast. Of course, even though I say it's funny peculiar that does describe a basic, absolute basic requirement of human consciousness, it is still funny in that it's got no relationship to what I was talking about. It has no bearing whatsoever on the questions of good and evil, true and false, up and down. But since I brought it up in that particular way, let's go off on another slight tangent for a minute. That I could say, if any of this were true, as I've already said, then that would mean that all of the so-called questions, all the problems, all the conflicts are meaningless as perceived. They would be meaningless if man could be forced to see it. Where I was going off for a moment, throughout our meetings I have periodically used such a term. I'll say something and say, well, if people could be forced to see it. Being that we're in the midst of a nondescript night, I might as well stop for a minute and go into that. What does it mean when I say if men could be forced to see it, if people could be forced to see it? Or if people were allowed to see it, see such and such. Well, obviously, I'm referring to the fact that they would be forced to see or allowed to see something that's not normally perceived. And it would be such as, if this were possible, that you could take all of their molecules and you could stick them get them forced into a trinary press. And you could turn it, and it's like you could mash them and squish them. All the molecules down into an unnatural state of cohesion. And then they could see that the subject at hand, whatever it was, they could see the subject at hand was actually meaningless as they perceived it. That is, that they individually, if this unnatural, impossible thing could occur, they would suddenly see that this thing under discussion, whatever it was, that I always speak about, react to, take seriously like everybody else, is meaningless to me individually. Now that all my molecules from every part of me at every given time, it has crossed into the 4D world, and you in some way have got all my molecules that I've ever had, all the arrangements and all the ones I will have during this little tenure here on this planet, and they've been squished down into some kind of very unnatural state. And now I perceive that the thing we're talking about is meaningless to me. It just is. It is just meaningless. In other words, I do not have the least idea what it's about. If we're talking about the question of good and evil, just to pick out a for instance, that is meaningless. I don't mean that I don't have the theological background. I mean literally all my molecules now being crushed down into this little piece of, not silly putty, silly plutonium. It is meaningless to me. All ideas of good and evil is meaningless. In other words, I have no idea, none whatsoever, what the hell that means. None. That would be force somebody or allow somebody to see that which would be unnatural. And that's what, in a humorous way, I'm suggesting would happen. It can't happen. I can't do it. There is no such press. But that's what I mean in general when I say something. such as, if men could be forced to see this, then such and such will be true. There would be humanity's attitude in the city if people could be forced to see this. That's what it would be. Not forced to see it on the basis, bring them here and I'll talk them into it. Bring them here and I'll in some way convince them. Bring them here and I'll just say it. And through the power of great persuasion, or through whatever magic is instant here, that people will suddenly see it. They're not going to see it. But I am saying that that is what would be involved. It is a strange case. Is everything all right? Of us talking about it, because it sounds to some of you under the right conditions, it sounds as though, yeah, it's true, and other people could see it. They could not. But that's what it would be. And I say it for reasons. But that's what it would be if people could be forced to see something that they are not structured to see. Not them individually, the whole race. Everybody in the city. Everybody except the questionable people end up hanging around the bushes and the city limit signs. I guess we'll get back to the heart of the matter. What if there were no human, much less individual, significance to all the important questions? To any question you ever had. And I say to man or individually. So I'm saying the human race, what would seem to be to some of you in your city consciousness, culturally based questions, religiously based questions, humanitarian questions, then down to individually selfish questions. I don't care. A joke's a joke. What the hell? Can't you take a joke? It can run the spectrum from one end to the other. Just jump in wherever you want to and have a giggle. But all questions like, can we agree or not? What if that had no significance? That the only significance, the only reason there seems to be significance out here, that first there seems to be the problem, right? Of can we agree or not, like us as individuals? Can humanity ever agree? Can great religions ever agree? Can conflicting political opinions, economic philosophies, can they ever agree? That seems to be the problem. And then it's like people are looking out at somewhere in the future, the real significance, ultra significance, super significance. I mean, the problem's significant enough. My God, people are killing themselves right now. All over this planet, Ireland, Lebanon. Some of them even, in fact, down in Phoenix City, Alabama. And that seems to be a problem. People committing murder, mayhem, destroying their cities, their culture, their religion, their artifacts, their toes. There seems to be that. But then there seems to be, to good, significant-minded people, even super significance. That is, not only we got the problems now, but my God, what does this portend for the future? What if none of that has any significance? Really? What if it is just yet another example in the absolute need for contrast? That's all it is. Except you got to understand, if there was any validity to this, the underpinnings of this feeling of contrast would not survive if the participants, that is, the peoples, the little folksies, if they did not take it what? You're right. Seriously. Kid may be a kid, but when he's right, he's right. Take a bow, and never mind. I've laughed so hard my side hurts. Well, not that side, I don't. How about the questions, are we doomed to some sort of failure? Are we going downhill, or are we destined for better things? That seems to be a continuing, not just a philosophical difference of opinion of schools of thought throughout history, but individually, that is, in you. That some days you get up and it feels like Jesus. It's just a feeling. It's like down the laboratory that some kind of noxious fumes got going. They turned on. I hadn't told you a story about the Wuzodak yet, and it feels like, God, life sucks. You look in the mirror and you think, I suck. Then you put on your clothes to go running and you look at it and you think, these clothes suck. You look outside and the weather sucks. And you see other people out jogging, you think everybody jogs sucks. And you see people walking, you think people that won't jog suck. Another day you get up and you don't know, you just want to say, Jesus. I wish I was religious, and I'd say, Jesus. And it is as serious as it can be to you, if you're a serious person. But what if it is nothing but yet another reflection of the absolute need for contrast? And that's all it is. What if that were true? And that's all it is. That it goes no further. That is the end of it. That's the beginning of it. That's the end of it. I told you it was funny. How about other such questions? How about, should I attempt to reform? Should I attempt to change? Now, I point out a long time ago, and almost everyone by now goes, oh yeah, I understand that all humans feel in some way dissatisfied. Everyone feels a little itchy. Everybody feels the need that I should be doing something differently. What if? It's nothing but the need for contrast. That would be beyond just being a little silly. If that were true, that would just be downright, I'd just be a thigh slapper. It does bring up something else. I hate to even skate along the possible edge of seriousness, much less, God forbid, significance. But how about these so-called eternal questions that I don't have to keep enumerating? But what's life about? Is it going up or down? Where did the battle between good and evil come from? And why does it seem that sometimes the undesirable team's winning? All that kind of shit. You do know, I'll point out one more time real quickly, that these questions have never, ever been satisfactorily addressed, much less answered. No one's satisfied with the answers. No one. Here's what's really silly and funny. What if there's a very good reason for that? Not the reason anybody ever imagined, like, well, God did not intend man to understand why evil sometimes wins. You know, Jesus Christ, give me a break. They've been saying that so long, it's no longer funny. They were saying it 3,000 years ago, and some little pizza-faced kid in college right this minute, at some night school taking Philosophy 101, or wearing his training collar backwards, trying to get in the first quarter of theology, somewhere, some kid right now, if not some professor who studied for years and years and has a beard and learned how to stroke it, and admits that that's part of being a minister, a rabbi, a philosopher. My son, is to confront the fact that some of these questions don't have answers. What if that there is a very good, and from my view, of course this silly view I'm talking about, a very good reason why? They got no answers because they're not a question. They're a statement. They're a statement of the reality of contrast. That the only reason they're there, that there's no answer to why good triumphs over evil, because there's no such thing as good and evil. There's contrast. That you got to have contrast to be conscious. Life's got to have contrast to grow. And as far as man being a prime area of his growth, of life's growth, I didn't mean to say his, of life's growth, is contrast. And that there is no difference. What if, silly as it is, what if, literally, not some theoretically, in any sense, what if literally there's no difference between the concepts, the apparent conflict, the apparent contrast, if you insist, between good and evil and sweet and sour? That they are absolutely the same thing. There's no difference between good and evil and up and down. None. There's no difference between good and evil and me and you. There's no difference between me and you and I and me. long as I'm being this silly, let me point out what would be the ultimate. Let me do my acronym first, always. The kid likes it. What would be the UC? That's not the University of Chattanooga. The great UC, the ultimate contrast. And it just struck me what it would be. It's 2 words, and it's not Jesus saves. As master stroke-ish as that one was. The ultimate contrast, 2 words. I won't. There is human consciousness. There is life's growth. There is, now that I think about it, how about this? All of these what-you-call-ems. Well, that's not what you call them. Monks, holy men, fakers, recluses, hermits, would be holy men. One and all times, all places, among other things besides smelly feet, what have they all had in common? Down with wanting shit. Am I right? Or when I'm right, I'm right. We're not talking about just pew warmers, as they're called down south. We're talking about people that say they're taking it seriously. If there's one thing, inter alia, but if there's one thing I'll mention right now, since I only mention one thing at a time, if there's one thing they got in common, it's down with wanting stuff. God don't want us to want stuff. If you want stuff, you get all deranged. If you want stuff, you get off the track. If you want stuff, you'll end up with somebody else's wife. You'll end up with somebody else's car. And you got to tell the cops, oh, I got one just like, oh, what a mistake. The way to be holy, or the way to get holier, is don't want stuff. Don't eat. How about for years, thousands of years, something's supposed to be holy about fasting. Nobody ever took it to molecular level to get really off this funny track. What if these people found out that it cuts down on certain chemical activity and it has another effect on what seems to be the molecular brain activity, and everybody thinks, well, hey, it's in some way the gods want us to fast, and it's good to give up food on Wednesday, and those that would be holy, they try to give up food many times, many places throughout history. Hey, I'm going to give up food all the time. It's so good not to have. Let's close down the lab. Won't you try it? Back on the subject. As long as we're not relating anything, I figure I'd throw in something absolutely unrelated to even this stuff that's not related. The ultimate contrast, I won't. Did you think about it? I talked too fast and kept running on. That is the ultimate contrast. That is the contrast of contrast. That is the contrast de la contrast. That is the cream de la you know what. It is the contrast, what would eat all contrast. Any contrast you can think about fits into, on the human level, anything having to do with human activity, human consciousness, is I won't. There is the ultimate contrast. Doesn't matter. I want a different car. I want a different sex partner. I want a different attitude. I want a different stomach. I want a different nose. I want a different income. I want a different house. I want a different life. I want to quit thinking like this. I want a different set of thinkings. I want a different set of feelings. I want to be somewhere else right now. I want to sit down. I want to stand up. I want to be cooler. I want to be hotter. It is the ultimate contrast. Without it, would you be alive? Without it, would you be human? Without it, would you be conscious? And even being funny, I'll have to tell you a non-funny answer. New. And yet, all the religions, all the would-be holy systems, individually, people attempting to be super good, super insightful, what do they get down on is wanting stuff. If you could cut out wants, you would be, and fill in the blank. Super person. All you got to do is cut out wants. It wouldn't be conscious. It wouldn't be human. There'd be no contrast. If you were following any of this, I could point this out, that not just on the individual level, that in a certain way, all of the religions, all the philosophies, through that whole spectrum, from a certain view, you could see them as being one aspect inside of life's body that is attempting on its own to eradicate all contrast. That's what every religious system is about. That's what every philosophy that's ever popped up was about. I got a couple of seconds. Think about it. Those of you that can think in manners funny. Every religion that popped up, every so-called philosophy, whether it came from your garbage man having a fleet of madness after a couple of beers at the bar, whole schools of philosophical thought, political thought, economic philosophy, every one of them can be summed up as being an attempt, one-sided, off by itself, but it was an attempt to eradicate contrast. What? All right, let's figure out an obvious one if I got to do this kind of stuff for you. What is it to be a Christian? To eradicate all non-Christian stuff. If you're going to be a Christian, you can't do anything that Jesus wouldn't have done. You can't do anything that a Christian wouldn't do. If you got a set of rules, which all religions got some kind of set of rules somewhere. If you live by the rules, you eradicate all behavior of not living by the rules. Remember the two sets? It's an attempt to eradicate all contrast. And it don't work. But then the people in the city say, well, yeah, it don't work because we got all the evilness in the world working against it. If it wasn't so pitiful, it'd be funny. No, if it wasn't so funny, it'd be pitiful. Nah, fuck it. It can all be seen as one aspect, one part over here in life's body itself, attempting on its own at one particular time to eradicate all contrast. Me saying it doesn't work, of course, there's always another even humorous aspect. Not only does it not work, that is, the religion, the philosophy, the new theory of, hey, let's do so-and-so. And no matter what it is, what they're saying is, at least in one area, let's eradicate all contrast. That is, let this philosophy, let this new idea prevail. And we're talking about prevail, baby. You got to do away with all opposition, which is synonymous with contrast. When I say that it does not work, part of the little humor is it quickly does what? Oh, all right, I'll tell you. It splinters into new contrast itself. That as soon as you got the religion stating a fact, no matter what it says, I'll translate it for you, it's stating, let's do away with all contrast. The next day, by that afternoon, they splintered up into their own contrast, into the Orthodox and to the Reform. All right? The fascists take over. It's let's call it a new version of fascism. And they holler and they hoot and whatever it takes, an hour, 10 minutes. No sooner they get to stating whatever apparently the purpose, which the purpose is, let's eradicate all contrast. Then they take a bow, see what it has, and it takes at least two people to start it. That is, somebody who said it and somebody who listened to it. There's got to be at least the entertainer and the audience, even if it's just two people. But as soon as it's stated, unless it's going to be forgotten, which oftentimes happens, but if it's going to have any viability, what happens? They immediately fall into splinters. That is, they immediately contrast by saying, wait a minute, you are already getting too liberal in your fascist views. And that guy says, not me. That here's immediately, it turns into, if there was such a thing, a right-wing fascist division and a left-wing fascist division. I think it's safe for us to stop here for a second and turn over the tape by leaving it at this ridiculous point that it simply never works. And yet it repeats itself not every 2,000 years. It repeats itself every 2 minutes. It repeats itself every 2 seconds. Every time you believe, I need to change. What you're saying is, I want to eradicate all contrast. Is it asking too much, expecting too much, that these tapes will be seen by virgins, people with little exposure to this, and for the last 30 or 40 minutes, this kind of ranting and raving and real low-class Borscht Belt mystical humor or whatever the hell it was, and me asking questions, saying how ridiculous it is, when the truth is it ain't ridiculous. When the truth is I wasn't asking questions. When the truth is I was not trying to be funny, which of course is funny in itself. But why should I worry about really whether it's being unfair to the newer people? Hell, is it being unfair to some of you older people? Because some of you missed it. But I hadn't been telling jokes since we started tonight. How about? I still can't promise any pertinence. Once you start off in an unrelated manner, you should stay what? Pennant. No, lated. How about ordinarily perceived time being synonymous with AHT, all human troubles, distress, discomfort, grievances, vexations, worries, agitations, quandaries, quagmires, all around in general, a big old can of 3-in-1 agonies. 3-in-1 woes. All human troubles being synonymous with time as it is ordinarily perceived. Well, as silly as it is, I can ask you this. Can you see that there must be a feeling of, well, instead of feeling, there needs to be a contrast, now that I think about it. A contrast between you and the troubles. There is inherent in the neural wiring and the lower chemical activities of this thing called a human being that makes it incumbent on human consciousness for any feeling that you have personally, I don't care how fucking personal it is, of some trouble going on right now, or troubles in general. There is the feeling of distance between you and the trouble. There's got to be. You and the trouble are not one, or you would not be conscious of it, because there would be no, what do you call it, contrast. There's got to be two samples. In this case, the trouble and yours truly. And so I'm pointing out that one way to see this distance, a very precise way, almost a clinical way to see it, is there's a distance in time. There is. Now you can say, all right, I've got troubles, and not in general. I've got a trouble that's going on now. No, it ain't going on now. It's never going on now. There is always a feeling of distance between you and the trouble. I don't care if the trouble is you found out that you've got a hyperactive liver. And you can say, well, how personal can it be? It's part of me. It's in here. But your feeling, your consciousness of the trouble is distance from you. Always. And when I say that in fact, a clinical approach to the, there is always a feeling of distance between you and the trouble. I don't care if the trouble is you found out that you've got a hyperactive liver. And you can say, well, how personal can it be? It's part of me. It's in here. But your feeling, your consciousness of the trouble is distance from you. Always. And when I say that in fact, a clinical approach to the difference is time-wise, not distance-wise, not as you might think, if you thought, along these lines. I wasn't being smart. The kid said that. I didn't say that. He said that, and I'm just repeating it. You might say, instead of a blown-out liver, let's say that you say, all right, I got a trouble. And the trouble is with this other person, with this other man, this other woman, family, business associate, no matter who gives a. I've got this problem, and you could say that the trouble, if we're going to talk about distance between the two, we're talking about the distance is actually physically. It's a physical distance. Yeah, you can say that because you and another person are not occupying the same skin. But it's not physical distance. It's time. Troubles exist in human consciousness either by contrast. Either apparently you thinking anywhere from just the immediate past to such things as, well, the doctor just told me this afternoon it's getting worse. Hell, that's a trouble. That's a distress. But you are distanced from it. What you're conscious of right then, daydreaming to yourself, telling someone, how's your trouble? Oh, you mean my liver? Well, I went to the doctor for my weekly checkup. In fact, I just got back. And he told me. On the other hand, you think about Jesus. How's it going to be when it gets worse? There is always an arm's length between you and every, quote, trouble. There is. And it's not a matter of physical displacement. It's time division. Oh, all right. Time contrast. If any of this had any bearing on anything, then I could say that a revolutionary view, if somebody was trying to not only see this, but then do something about it, assuming that anything can be done about it, I would say that the revolutionists would have to grab the problem and jerk it right up into your face. No more arm's length. No more dancing with the whore. You'd grab it and pull it right up into your face. Not the natural state that I point out in the city of everyone living in everybody else's face. That doesn't count. Because it's got to be closer than that. To realize that what seems to be a trouble, what seems to be a problem, and everybody wants to discuss it. Thank God I got most of you where you don't discuss them with me, but you want to discuss them. You want to discuss them with yourself. You and you want to discuss it. How else can we save man from himself? How else can you talk to yourself unless there's a contrast? Yes, I am worried. Really? Well, tell me about it. Well, try and cheer up. You shouldn't be. How about that book you read one time that says, the more you worry about a problem, the worse it gets? Yeah, you're right. I read that. Who in the hell is doing this talking? Your senses. Looking at your brain vis-a-vis, just for the time being, for shorthand, as being a kind of analyzing ability of information coming in from the senses, we got to have the contrast. Or the brain would not work. Or if it worked, we're back to the supreme moot point, you wouldn't know whether it worked. So there's got to be the feeling that I can save myself from me. I can change. I should change. I can talk to myself. I can think about my problems. If there was a revolutionary view to any of this, a way to handle this, it would be that you would have to grab that whore, whatever it was, and pull it right up into your face. I don't care how close you think you started out. And really being funny, now I mentioned that, I might suggest to you that somewhere in that area is what I've talked about about just do it. You got your choice. You either do it or you don't do it. If you don't do it, you're always removed in time. You're always displaced from the problem. Now what if? God knows I've been silly enough tonight. What if that's why there seems to be no solution to human problems? Is that you're operating in two different time frames. It's not because you are weak. It's not because your habits are too strong and your character is too feeble. It's not because the cards are stacked against you, although in your case I don't blame the cards for being stacked against you. But it's none of that. I'm saying, of course, what if it's none of that? That you're operating in two different time frames. If there was any truth to this, look how simple it is. For instance, it'd be like that you are continually, with your best shot, with your intelligence, with your forwardness, with the hand that you have been dealt, with the cards you have tried to stick down in your boot and up your sleeve. Here you are trying your best to finally deal with, to overcome, to have some effect on Wednesday's problem. And it's fucking Thursday. All right, wait a minute. Next time we pick up the scene here, and you have doubled your efforts. So you said. You apparently are now sweating 45s instead of 38s. And now you're working on Thursday's problem, except, oh dear, as you might suspect I'm about to say, it is now Friday. And this goes on for how many years? How long are you going to live? That kind of displacement. Back to where I started this side of the tape. What if, truly, not being funny, that all so-called problems, everything, I don't care what, from illness to death, broken hearts, torn romances, economic rents in your fiscal cloth, no matter what they are all synonymous with time displacement. Were it not for your individual and humanity's collective, but your individual perception of time, none of your problems could survive. They would gasp and be dead. That is, they would go from consciousness. You could not conceive of them. We're not talking about some other kind of reality that, well, yeah, your liver's still going downhill. Hell, you're going downhill in toto. We're not talking about that. But you would not be conscious of it. Which that's another question for another time. Does it matter if you're sick and don't know it? Well, as long as we're here, how many of you have heard these stories and you just never paid any attention? The guy goes to the doctor for the first time in 40 years, and he says, I've been having a pain over here on my side for about the last 20, and the doctor looks at him and says, oh my God, you got lung cancer, and he dies the next day. And that some weird Uncle Harold showed up at the funeral and said, well, that's what you got for going to the doctor. And you what? You laughed, thinking that funny shit don't count. Back to the subject. I'm not saying anything really about your liver. Why should I reveal confidentialities between you and I? But we're talking about that you could not be conscious of whatever the problem was, whether it seemed or whether it was apparently physical, limited to you, or whether it had to do with a relationship between you and somebody else. If you are not conscious of it, what kind of trouble is it? How can it be a trouble of which you're unaware? If you take away the time displacement between you and the trouble, if you grab the trouble and you jerk it right up into your face, which some of you seem to like this before, that is another version of pulling a knife on the mother, and you pull it right into your face, and you take away the displacement, you take away the ordinary perception of time, where did the problem go? Where do troubles run for their lives? When you take away the contrast between you and the trouble, there is no room to say, well, I would like to quit smoking. Well, I would like to get more exercise. Well, I would like to be able to control my temper. Well, you can like all you want to. The Tango Palace never closes. The dancers finally die. Every 70 years or so, you got a whole new group of dancers, but the palace stays open. And so you and everyone else can say, well, I would like to. I'd like to discuss it. I'd like to hear more about it. I'd like to think about it. I'd like to work my way up. I'd like your opinion. Contrast, 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 contrast. You couldn't speak if you only knew one word. You couldn't move if you could only take one action. You could not be conscious if you only had one thought. Therefore, wouldn't this be silly if the reason people can't change is, as soon as you talk about change, you have got to have contrast. You could not even think about change. We couldn't talk about change were it not for the great inability to change. If you could change, you wouldn't talk about it. If you could change, there would be no such thing as change, because you'd be in whatever condition it was. Well, sure, some of you are laughing now like you hear something, but hell, I told you what the ultimate contrast was. I won't. As soon as you say I won't, you can't have it. Which, of course, is not true in the 4D world. It's not true, but the way it appears in the 3D world, the way consciously, we're not talking about some science fiction silliness now. We're talking about everyday life. As soon as you say, I won't, you can't have what it is you want. You can't. It's impossible. If you could, you wouldn't be conscious of owning it. You would not be conscious of there being a distance between you and the thing. It cannot be, though. As silly as it is, it can't be true. Well, all right, it couldn't be true for many people. Life would be killing itself. It cannot be true for humanity. They would be killing themselves. You would no longer be conscious. You would be dull, you'd be flat, you'd be colorless, you'd be non-ambiguous. You would have no more contrast than an earthworm. It is only humans, regardless. I know that many people, and I will not exclude anybody, can get feelings towards your pets, for instance, domesticated animals, dogs, that they got their own little personality and such. But you don't ever notice it's only your dog has personality. Everybody else's dog is colorless, except to them. So you figure that, if you can figure that. Every other creature here is dull, flat, colorless, because there is no contrast. Real quick, there is enough basic sensual contrast that keeps them, as we would call it in the 3D world, it keeps them alive. It keeps them at their various times being dinner and other times being diner. But there is no consciousness because there is no contrast. There is no contrast within them of a feeling of a distance. Dogs do not feel like that there is a canine equation of dog plus not dog. Only humans. And there has got to be what seems to be to consciousness, that is neural activity, a contrast. If there is no contrast, if there is no time disjunction between you and me, between me, this conscious me, that I can look around, I know that I am here. And I know I'm separate from this, and the podium, and the cup, and you, and the lights, and up here. Without that contrast, I would have the personality of an earthworm. Don't you say that. If we were talking about a revolutionist, I would have to point out to you that the revolutionist would have no respect whatsoever for such city affairs and ideas as time. None. Among other things, but since we're talking about that tonight, you would have no respect, hence fear, for city ideas such as time. In the city, speaking about time since I'm here, there's another great phrase that runs throughout the history of cities, the history of man. And let me sum it up into, it's this kind of description. People say, I do not have the time to change. Not just in general, but I do not have the time. If it seems to be pointed out to them, or it seems to be internally motivated, where the fuck that is, that in them, that they seem to be acknowledging that I should be doing something differently. That is, in contrast to the way I normally act, feel, think, I should be doing this, but I do not, literally, I'm telling you, I do not have the time. I'm acknowledging that I should do better, that I should do this. I do not have the time. Let me translate what they're saying. Not individually, because they're not motivated to say it. Life is grumbling, musing down in one part, and what they're saying is this, is that I see no way out of my time troubles. I perceive no escape. That's what they're saying. That's what the molecules in you that speak say when they say that, when they think that I would certainly do something differently, in contrast to what I'm not doing differently. If I had the time, it's not some kind of psychological rationale. It is not some cheap cop-out on individuals' parts. They are saying that my human consciousness, being confronted with a contrast that I should do this, I feel like I should, and yet I do this, I perceive no way out of this trouble, this quagmire, this quandary, this vexation. And so they say, I do not have the time. And in a very crude, ha-ha, and funny way, they're telling the truth. It is not correct. It's flawed, it's imperfect. It lacks full data, or it lacks data that's even available here at this level, for them to say that I lack the time, but in a boorish kind of way, in a procacious kind of way, they're telling the truth. But the reason that it seems to lead nowhere, the reason that they cannot seem to use it is it's not correct. It can be true by being flawed, but to be correct, you would have to bring in the time element. On the other hand, the real revolutionist might say something like this. He might say, I have all the time in the world because all the time in the world has me. Then you got something. You could look upon that. Did that go too fast? I was not being funny. He might say that he has all the time in the world because all the time in the world has him. Parenthetically, I could point out, what's your choice? What's the alternative? It would be a kind of tangent solution to all troubles. Either way, to either have all the time in the world, all the time that you need, all the time that you want, any way you want to phrase it, or have no time. It's the same thing. It's to pull that sucker right in your face and say, all right, I got all the time in the world. I mean, here is what I have been calling a problem. It's simply a contrast. We will dance. I'll never get tired. I'll dance until your legs turn into apple butter. Time just means nothing. I'm not even going, I got it. Or the same thing. Not back in the city, of course. This is ridiculous. Or to say, I got no time. And that's it. That's the kind of thing that if you went back in the city and they say, boy, you changed. You go, what? Or you go back into your own city and somebody wants to say, you changed. And your nonverbal response is, I don't do fucking interviews. I don't respond to rat hole watchers. I don't respond to ordinary people commenting on me. That's in your own state, of course, where you are absolutely free if you're an enlightened tyrant to treat the people like, fuck you peasants. What the hell does a king care that somebody comes up? Some lice-infected, dunderheaded peasant comes up to the king and says, my, you look nice since you've lost a little weight. Is that going to make his day or what? You're a peasant in your state. If any of you new people have any doubt, we're not talking about Bulgaria, folks. That some dunderheaded peasant with an IQ based upon past behavior, feel free to judge it, with an IQ of like 7, tells the king, my liege, I am sorely impressed with your intelligence. Hey, is that going to send him off on a spree or what? I mean, it makes you just feel good thinking about it. To be recognized by your what? Your inferiors. Boy, what a treat. My. What else would spur a man on? How else do you know you're doing all right other than the contrast of someone saying, my, how I approve of what you've done. How I am impressed with what you've accomplished. Well, I just hardly know what to say. I'm just overcome. I know now that I have some purpose in continuing. I feel as though there is some value in my eternal struggle. Can I be funny or what? And yet, what seems to be the purpose in change, what seems to be the kinds of things that I've talked about in and out of the bushes for these many months, continuing to warn that these are not psychological commentaries, but me pointing out that if you're going to do something, don't talk about it. If you're going to do something, I don't mean just don't talk about it to your mother or your girlfriend. Jesus, give me a break. Don't talk about it. Don't contrast the situation. Don't acknowledge the contrast that, wait a minute, what I'm going to do is change. I'm going to get up and I'm going to start running. Probably tomorrow morning. I'm going to start running 2 extra miles. Who can I tell? Honey, are you still awake? Let me tell you what I've decided. Now, why bother with somebody else? At least look yourself dead in the eye. I mean, if you're going to deal with inferiors, why not go first class? It's all right. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to get up and run in the morning. No, maybe you will, maybe you won't. Who cares? You won't do it right. As long as there's a contrast, as long as it is a trouble, as long as it is a problem, what you imagine to be the benefit, which ultimately is you think the benefit is the eradication of the desire of wanting to run. The eradication of all contrast. But you have some other imagined, immediate goal in mind, you never get it. You never run enough that suddenly one day you think, hey, it did it. And then you never run again. Am I right? Damn right I'm right. I'm going to go and I'm going to exercise until I get to the point that just suddenly I'll go, hey, all the contrast, that is the problem that brought about me wanting to exercise, the motivation, something happened. I no longer want to exercise. And that's the end of it. You know better. Not in the city. You stop, and it's 2 or 3 weeks later, and whatever seemed to have been the motivation, that is the contrast, is back again. Jesus, I'm getting back out of shape. I'm putting back on weight. I'll go study. I'm going to go read books, and I'm going to study until I get so smart that I won't worry about how smart I am. Such a day never comes. You cannot eradicate contrast unless you're going to commit suicide. So if there was going to be a revolutionary approach, it would be, I got all the time, I'll dance until you drop, or else you motherfucker, I don't have another second. It's the same thing. I am not going to discuss it with my inferiors. The king does not go out and ask peasants, do you think I'm putting on weight? Do you think I should have my hair cut differently? Sometimes I wonder whether people really know how intelligent and talented I am. What do you think? Huh? And they say, my liege, right on. Who are you going to discuss it with? What if all such discussions are nothing but the need for contrast? Why doesn't it work? I start out suggesting to you in my jocular vein that it would be meaningless in a certain way. If something's meaningless, that's why it won't work. That's why there's no answer to it. The question is inoperable. That it doesn't matter. It's what meaningless is. That what we're talking about is the all-abiding, all-encompassing, non-stop, absolute requirement for contrast. And you can call it I'm too fat, I'm too thin, I'm too dumb, I'm too smart, I'm too good, I'm too evil. Call it. Call it whatever you want to. It's contrast. About to run out of time here. The kid said that. I'm just repeating it. Could you see, right quickly, one or two other things. Could you see ordinary human memory as being a kind of necessity to freeze and to retrieve troubles when? Past. Could you see memory as being a prime supporter of contrast? Why else do you have memory? Think about it. If you didn't have memory, and there were such things as problems, let's just assume they are. Problems would come and nothing stays forever, right? Your grandmother, even the Old Testament said, you know, troubles don't last forever, at least not the same one. So you'd have a trouble and they'd go away. And thank God, though, if it wasn't for memory, they'd be gone and forgotten. But hey, not so. You can remember the bastards. You got to remember them. Since I quoted the Old Testament, if you call that a quote, what was the other one of them saying that troubles are with man always? Like, I guess, back in the city, they treat that as being the nature of the afflictions that the gods placed on man for his comeuppances. But to say that troubles will be with you always is to say what? You got a memory. That's why they're with you always. If you didn't have a memory, if it weren't for contrast, whatever problems, assuming there were problems, whatever you had in the past, they're gone. But thank God, it's not so. And so it is true that these great old prophets back in the Mediterranean area, back a long time when, could truthfully say, these problems, my children, will be with you always. All they were saying, they didn't know it is, hey, you got a memory? Welcome to the club. Let's all go sit down, have a glass of wine, and talk about our what? Miseries, discomforts, vexations. You mean right now? Well, no, it's all right now, but let me tell you what happened to me. Let me tell you who's coming to visit. Let me tell you I'm going to be audited next week. We have run out of TIME. Don't give up your dreams, even if the chase has apparently been abandoned. And could the heart of this new data that I have been producing be simply to identify the real cause and the ultimate culprit of everything as life itself? That there is no contrast. There's not even a slight variation of you or anybody else or me doing something just a little teeny weeny bit askew, just a little off course, just a little bit. That if there is a supreme culprit, the ultimate cause is life itself, there. No sham humility here. Forget all these major religions and all these philosophies. There is the ultimate eradication of contrast. Because if that were true, and if you could be forced to see it, after that, what would you have to, what would you talk about?
And Kyroots said, "Well, as you may have suspected, it is more UFNs. And I still don't know why they're being blamed on me. But whoever's responsible, here they are again."
Never fail to salute the ugly. After all, if they get ahead, it is surely on merit.
Never forget how few people you may discuss something with have ever given the matter any thought at all.
Never borrow trouble unless you've considered the full tax advantages of leasing.
Never bother to have your Rolex tuned up if you're going to be hanging out with people who are adamant in their belief that all things come to those who wait, etc., 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 tick, tick, tick.
Never, in an attempt to gain some personal space, should you, in a crowded restroom, shout, "Man overboard."
Never, while discussing the metaphysical mysteries of existence with an armed theologian, use the word enema for enigma.
Never pay extra for an infield pass unless you're absolutely sure you will not have to spend the entire race day seated on a NASCAR driver's greasy brother-in-law.
Never call a famous person you admire by their first name. It can cause them to explode.
Never base your avocational plans on a course entitled "How to Become a Former Celebrity."
Never patronize a hospital, a police station, or a law firm who are advertising a going out of business sale.
Never, even in a good faith attempt to be a good old boy and entertain your camping buddies, should you agree to zip... Should you agree to... You might have to read.
No, you do.
Should you agree to zip yourself up nude in a sleeping bag with a stimulated patcher?
Never attempt suicide with an apartment-sized clothes dryer.
Never agree to go to Tahiti unless you're absolutely sure that they mean the real Tahiti and not the one in South Carolina.
Never, even in the heated spirit of Halloweenic fun, should you try and scare the bejesus out of the Archbishop of Cranberry.
Never allow them to conduct even a low-level nuclear test in your ear.
Never ask a dinner companion to pass you the rolls if they have just been speaking favorably of the joys of sexual acts involving less than two people.
Never, in a contest between planning and chance, bet on the former.
Never agree to show a pirate where the restrooms are if he has his swash already unbuckled.
Never blame your intestines for what your stomach did. Never blame your stomach for what your mouth did. Never blame your mouth for what your eyes did, and never blame your eyes for what your brain did. And of course, never, never, never blame your poor widow brain for anything. There, there, little brain.
Never stand and remove your underwear while they are playing your host's national anthem.
Still rolling? You people out of town, someone else already represented me with, I guess other than the possibility of all this coming to an abrupt halt, somebody else has asked, other than that, what I guess would be the big question, and that is, how can we arrange, they won't know, and I'll go ahead and present it as the big question for the hour, how can we arrange things so we can begin to meet every other night? That's one. It's something I've mentioned at the tail end of the tape, but I won't mention to you people here and in the other cities, is you should not be giving up dreams. Everybody is wired up with some kind of dream. And I don't mean anything all that weird. But everyone is wired up with some dream. It seems easier in times past to describe men's dreams, to sail off around the world in a boat, visit foreign places. But women have got their own versions, and they're becoming more and more a part of their consciousness of their own dream. And then it seems as though this is what happens, that the dream gets abandoned. And you can look at it as a very specific, molecular, that is physical event. Normally, the dream becomes abandoned when women get pregnant. In their case, the dream of men, it seems to get abandoned when they accept responsibility for a woman / family. There's nothing unusual. I'm not saying fact that because all of you are even past the point of that being something to look forward to. It's already happened. But I'm telling you, there's no reason, just because the apparent literal physical chase of the dream may be temporarily put aside. Do not abandon, do not give up the dream. If and when the day comes that chemically, whatever, in some way, somebody says, hey, are you still planning to buy a boat and sail around the world? And you realize, maybe, you realize, gee, I guess not. I hadn't even thought about it in years. The dream seems to have abandoned you. Maybe. But until, if and when that day comes, I'm telling you people, do not abandon the dream. Even though the chase may seem to have been put aside, even though it may be that you cannot make any immediate plans about, all right, I am going to, let's say, I'm going to have the boat paid for in such and such year, and I'll have all my kids in college and this and that. Don't take anything I have ever said. Do not take your present attitude toward this, of me saying things and having Kyroots say things, that no one becomes famous in the city except those who intend to, and that how far removed many people's dreams are from reality. Don't let that get you. If you had a dream to be a great ballerina, to be a great musician, to be a writer, to sail around the world, and you had it, there's nothing to apologize for. There's no need to talk about it. You should know that by now. this was not what happened, but some of you might even look back now and think that part of the dream, or the dream in part, got crushed and damaged by excessive talk. You didn't know better at the time. There could not have been another possibility. So in a sense, some of you might look back and say, I almost talked it to death. Forget that. If you still got a piece of it, that you got a dream of dancing with the New York Ballet, of having a bestseller, I'm not going to describe any more. And you should know the dangers of the kind of contrast between trying to live and simply thinking of action as opposed to action. But I'm talking about something much deeper than that. And it's not caused, if any of you have gone this far, to think, well, I used to have dreams of being a famous musician, but I can see now it's some kind of psychological rebellion against my father, the way he ignored me, and I thought, well, boy, I show him a lesson. He hated rock and roll music so much, I thought, boy, what I'll do is I'll become real famous and I'll play Carnegie Hall, the kind of place that he loves, all them Heifetz guys and all them. I'll be there and I'll make a lot of money, and boy, he'll be sorry. And you think it's some kind of psychological, some kind of cultural pressure. Only life can make cultural pressure, and it makes cultural pressure in the form of what? Men and women's and people's. Do not abandon your dream. If the dream finally seems to abandon you, and I'm not saying it will, but if it seems to, that will be natural. You won't notice it. You won't be hurt. But most of you, many of you, that has not happened. Many of you believe that you have abandoned the chase, and then many of you feel, if you were questioned, that you're resigned, like, that was just a dream and I'll never do it. If it's still there at all, if you can still feel the contrast of what you are and the contrast that you like to do it, I'm telling you from a revolutionary view, I'm telling you from me to you, do not give that up. The tape itself, where I ask you people again, could it be true? Could it be correct? If it's so, has it got any pertinence at all? That you could look at the heart of all this info that I have done forever, and wherever this may be going, if there is any climax in my lifetime or in your lifetime, if for any reason you had to sum up, trying to eradicate all distinctions, counter-distinctions, counterpoint, counterpart, and still be able to verbalize it, which requires some contrast. But could it be that the ultimate description of what this new info is simply that life itself is the culprit? Life itself is the ultimate cause. Period. That's it. Finally a period. No more commas. That's it. Could that be true? Hell, who knows? The kid made me ask you this. We just had some few minutes here on the tape. And for you people out of town, I guess that's all. And for us here, that may be all. If that noise coming down from those planes are what I think it is, that may be all, period. But in case I'm wrong, have a nice day.